Okay, I think I'm live. Alright, sounds good. I would just like to start this talk with the idea that looking back through history, uh, you see that every uh, generation of people or society, more like on a global scale, uh, have always had at least one like really core belief that they all shared and they all thought that it was like scientifically proven or it's just accepted to be truth, and it turns out that that belief ends up being wrong. Going back from looking at when people thought the earth was flat, and when people thought the earth was the center of the universe or the center of the solar system. Yeah, just every generation had some kind of core belief that they all accepted. They all just didn't question. They all just, assumed that somebody else did their due diligence and found the answers, scientifically. And question I pose is there something that we today, as a society, global society, is there something that we are that's something that we got wrong, but we all believe and accept as true? And I think we do have that problem, and I think the thing that we are mistaken about is consciousness. We just science from the beginning uh, agreed, made a agreement to study everything outside of conscious experience, but never to study consciousness, because they knew, well, Rene Descartes, the original scientist, uh, believed that science didn't have the equipment yet or the intellect yet to tackle the problem. So he kind of like decided to put subjective experience and consciousness on the back burner. So, in other words, science would study everything in the universe, all the mechanics and how it would take everything apart and look at its parts and see what it's made of, and go deeper and look deeper and deeper and see what everything's made. But they would intentionally, excuse me, not study the subjective inner mind. They stayed away from that. Well, for that first main reason, that Rene Descartes believed science wasn't ready to tackle the problem yet, and number two, maybe more importantly, the church at the time had science decided to try somehow, some way, maybe through like thought experiments like Einstein developed. If science had tried to tackle the problem of consciousness, they would have ended up inevitably getting into areas of theology, and you know, it would rattle uh, some chains at the church. It wouldn't be good. Especially at that time, the church was persecuting people, literally burning them at the stake and hanging them. So it's probably not a good idea to talk about consciousness or what it is or where it comes from, especially that the church didn't. That was the church's domain. So science, from the beginning, decided we'll leave consciousness consciousness alone. Let the church deal with theology, deal with that, and science will deal with just the material world. And that's how we got started in the Western world, towards our belief system that we have today. And that's how we've developed our idea about death and dying, and basically about what we are. And well, basically, if you look in science books, there never was any experiments that they conducted that ever proved that the brain generates consciousness. There never was an experiment, nothing. You could look yourself. That's one of the things today that we all just accept, that, and we thought that somebody else must have did the due diligence and did the experiment, and we all just accepted it as scientific fact. But it's not scientific fact that the brain generates consciousness. It's just a speculation, and if you ask me, it's a big leap, because when you look at the brain and the devices, the parts that are connected to it, like your eyes, ears, nose, all your senses, anybody who looks at it, to be have an engineering degree, to look at it and realize that it's some kind of receiver. It's not a transmitter. It receives consciousness. It's my belief that consciousness it's something that's everywhere. It exists outside of you and outside of us, and our brains receive it and perceive it, and we put it together in our head. We have our inner voice telling us a dialogue about our ego and about what's going on and keeping track of time and everything. But I believe that the consciousness is something that we just all share. We all tap into it. It's something that's not individual, and it's non-dual, I believe is the phrase they use. Meaning it's not one, but it's not many. It's hard to explain. It's like a Eastern philosophy belief. But I think there's a lot to be said for Eastern philosophy, like Buddhism, because if you look at it, when they started to study the world, they decided to do the opposite of what Western world did. They decided, hey, instead of looking at the outside world and figuring it out, let's look inward. Let's first discover what is our true nature. What are we? And for thousands of years, they turned inward, and they used a very powerful tool that we have as humans called inference, where you can take information and put different pieces of information together and come to an obvious conclusion. And 99% of the time, you'll be correct if used properly. So with those tools and thought experiments also, like Einstein used, they sat in silence, and they shut off that inner voice, stopped the monologue, and studied and looked and looked deeper and deeper to see what was there, if anything, in between the words, in the silence, in the silent moments. What is it that resides in the mind if you can silence that inner voice? And they studied that for thousands of years, and they pretty much got it down pat. I mean, if there's different writings, it was originally orally passed down traditionally for thousands of years, so they don't even know how far back the beliefs go. But then it was written down, like in the Upanishads and there's different canons of the Buddhist text, and it's a very interesting topic. I believe heavily in secular Buddhism. That's Buddhism that doesn't deal with the religion aspect or any of the aspects of like going to temple and stuff like that. Secular Buddhism deals just specifically with consciousness and what it is and what we are and what's going on in the universe. pretty deep. And when you read some of the old writings like the Upanishads, and then if you look at some interesting things that they're learning at in physics, particle physics and stuff, like over at CERN, the Large Hadron Collider, that they I probably mispronounced that, but anyway, that they run all kinds of tests by smashing particles together. And the things that they're finding out are these, that there's basically the world is broken into two parallel existences. One is quantum and one is, well, I guess one is the micro, and then there's the macro. And on the micro level, when you go down to the subatomic level, the rules of physics change at some point. Where in everyday life, or in our rules of physics, things follow a certain order, like cause and effect. I just scratched the back of my neck. The cause was an itch, or the effect, and whatever, and I moved my hand with the effect. You get the idea. But when you get on a subatomic level, things like cause and effect start to lose meaning, and things like speed and trajectory and even position, and like physically where something is, starts to get fuzzy, and it gets real weird. It gets real deep. But if you really study it and get into it, it ties closely to the Eastern philosophy about consciousness. I know there's a lot of scientists today that argue and say, oh, the experiments in quantum make it it's just an illusion that consciousness has something to do with it. But if you learn about the double slit experiment, and then further later on, they did even more detailed double split experiments with detectors and stuff, and when you find out, if you read up on that, it'll blow your mind. It's as if consciousness is built into the universe, into the very fabric of every atom and every molecule. It's as if every particle knows or has some little small piece of consciousness. And I believe that's true. I believe that's exactly what it's telling us. But I think scientists are so stubborn and set in their ways, and there's a lot of things that they can't reproduce in a laboratory. And I think things like consciousness and subjective experience is one of those things that you can't put in a jar and label it and then take it apart. It's subjective. It doesn't exist in the physical world. And that's going to be my next topic, is about subjective reality and the physical world that we perceive, and is it really as physical and material as we think it is? So I'll see you next time. I hope you like the talk. If you did, hit me up, give me a thumbs up, and subscribe. Thank you.